No, I just like to start my lessons with this nice blank brick wall. All right. So a young man was at a singles bar hoping to meet somebody. Very attractive, beautiful woman walked in, sat down next to him. They introduced themselves. It was going pretty well. She said, "So what do you do for a living?" He said, "Well, actually, I work for my father. He owns a business, but he's getting up there in the years, and as soon as he passes away, the business will pass to me, and I will be worth $20 million." She said, "Oh, that's really interesting." And she went and became his stepmother. All right. Today we're going to be talking about democracy. Now let's think for a moment. Democracy. When we think of democracy, we might envision something that looks like this. Who invented democracy? Who knows this one? The Greeks. Democracy is a Greek word. It's C-R-A-C-Y, rulership, by the demos, which actually doesn't mean the individual people. It means by the districts. Democracy, it's a Greek word. It means when the districts have representatives and then the representatives vote, and that's how things happen. Now, when we think about American democracy, it's actually a little bit more complex than that. Where does it come from? How did we find out about it? How did we get this kind of democracy? Now, we do know this. When it comes to classifying knowledge, looking for words to classify knowledge, like the ology words like biology, psychology, sociology, these are all Greek words. Democracy is a Greek word. We, in the English language, when we want to make something sound really intelligent, we import a word from the Greek language. And when we want to make a building look really intelligent, we use Greek architecture. That is why our schools, I mean, when you think about what are the buildings that have Greek columns in front of them, it is often going to be schools, government buildings, libraries. When we want to kind of give that sense of like old time intelligence, we use Greek architecture. We in our culture, you could say that we in our culture, we consider, quote, the Greeks to be like the founders of intellect, to be the smartest people, to be, you know, the kind of cultural hero of intelligence and the classification of knowledge. Now, here we are looking at this thing. How much knowledge is there in here? Widely debatable. But how many of us here have ever been here in person, have ever stood in a spot like this and looked at the Capitol building like this? So some of us have gone there. Some of us have stood in front of the Capitol building. So if you've stood in front of the Capitol building, means you have also not only stood in front of these Greek columns and et cetera, this very, you know, impressive dome, but you've also seen this statue. What is this statue? Well, here, we're going to zoom in on that. What we've got here is, it is called the Statue of Freedom. Now, if you look at the face, if you look at the nose, that is what we call a Roman nose. This is a statue of a Roman goddess. However, she's dressed up like she's going to some kind of costume party. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to be the one to say it here. It's a very politically incorrect costume party. She is wearing a costume that is in very poor taste. This Roman goddess, she's wearing her Roman goddess clothing, but over that, she is wearing this Native American blanket, and she's wearing a feathered headdress. What we've got here is a statue of a Roman goddess, and she is kind of pranked up. She is dressed up as a Native American. Why? Now, you see, I'm pointing this out to you now, but I don't, not because I want you to write a letter to Washington and demand that they take the statue down. But why? Why the Roman goddess who is in this Native American costume? Democracy in the United States. The founding fathers, yes, they saw it as a Greek thing, a thing that the Greeks invented. But our democracy is a mix. It is a mix of Greek ideas of democracy and Native American ideas of democracy. Now think about this for a moment. First of all, Greece, the Greeks were not a democratic people. They were more, the Greek nations like Sparta, Macedonia, Athens. These were nations that were built on the backs of slavery. These were like little feudal kingdoms. They were like southern slave plantations. That is how they operated. Kingdoms like Sparta, Macedonia, Athens, and this is all 3,000 years ago. They were monarchies. They had kings. Now, about 3,500 years ago in Athens, which was one part of what we call Greece. Greece, just to get this into your head, Greece is about the size of Florida. It is a small country to begin with. And then within Greece, which is about the size of Florida, there was Athens, which might be like the size of Fort Myers or Fort Lauderdale. It was like a town within the Greek, constellation of city-states. So in one of these little towns in Greece, the town that we call Athens, the one that is really famous for the philosophers and the theater and that stuff, there was a brief experiment with rule by the districts. They overthrew their kings, and they decided that instead of having one king of Athens, they were going to break it up into districts. Each district would have elected representatives, and that they would all get together and rule. In Athenian democracy, it's true briefly, and this was an experiment that lasted about 100 years. It's true that people could vote. However, the people who could vote were only adult male landowners. So about 20% of the population 25% of the population got to vote. This experiment lasted about 100 years, and then the whole thing fell apart. They could not make it work, which when we think about modern democracy in the United States, which we've been doing for like 230 years, it's difficult, 50 years. We keep struggling to make it work. We need to remember, nobody has ever kept democracy alive this long. It always has its fundamental problems. It always seems like it's just about to fall apart. In ancient Athens, it did fall apart. The so-called founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, these people who we think of as the architects of our democracy, they had encountered this word democracy in some ancient texts that they had read. They had read about this failed experiment from 3,000 years earlier. They thought that sounded interesting, but they had never seen democracy. There was no democracy in Europe in the time of Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. What they did have was they witnessed a kind of representative government among the Native Americans. As Iroquois chief Oren Lyons wrote, how did they change from Englishmen to Americans? They saw and came to understand our idea of being free. The idea of being independent was everywhere they looked, and they liked it, and they wanted to become like us. When we look back at the early history, the colonial history of the United States, what we see is that some of the great thinkers, some of the people that we think of as the architects of our government, of our democracy, learned about representative government by showing up at negotiation meetings and listening to Native Americans who had already worked out forms of representative government. According to Iroquois legend, rule by the people, Iroquois democracy, was brought as a message from a person that they call the peacemaker. They say that before the peacemaker came, there had been no government and there had been no law. They say that for a long time, the only law was vendetta. The only law was revenge, an eye for an eye, that if somebody hurt you, you hurt them back. And if somebody hurt your clan, you hurt their clan. If somebody hurt your tribe, you went off and hurt their tribe. So the Iroquois say that there had been, for them, this long, dark age of lawlessness and violence, cycles of violence. And then they say that about 500 years ago, there was a person, maybe a messenger or a prophet, the person that they refer to as the peacemaker, who gathered the peoples together and said, we need to end these cycles of violence. And he coined this phrase. He said, the first step is that we all need to get together and bury the hatchet. This is an expression that we still use in modern English, but what do we mean? What does somebody mean when they say we need to bury the hatchet? Good, that's excellent. We need to let bygones be bygones. Bury the hatchet, it means not only, now when he did it, he said we need to literally bury our weapons. We need to bury our weapons of war. But also symbolically, we need to cut our losses. We need to say, this conflict between us has taken its toll on me. It has taken its toll on you. As long as we dwell on what we have lost, we are going to continue going after each other to try to get something back or to try to even the score. So to bury the hatchet not only means to let it go in the future, but also it means to cut your losses, to say, I'm willing to let go of what I have suffered in the past. And that if two people do that at the same time, then they can have a foundation of peace between them. So the peacemaker, they say, got all of the tribes together. And the first step was for everybody to agree that the wrongs, the loss, the damage, the violence of the past was all going to be laid to rest. Symbolically, they did this by burying weapons. Interestingly enough, if we were doing an archaeological survey in Northern Europe, we would find that in some of the wells, some of the deep lakes of Northern Europe, you find weapons, you find ancient weapons. And that Northern Europeans had a tradition that when two armies or when two nations got together to make peace, they would symbolize this by throwing their weapons into water, into a well or into a lake. So that would be like a Northern European version of burying the hatchet. Once the two sides have let go of their grievances, then they can begin to agree on things. Then there can be the beginnings of peace. When we think about peace, we might first think of peace as just the absence of violence, the absence of warfare. Actually, the Haudenosaunee concept of peace is more comprehensive than this. It is not only military in the sense that there will not be violence. The Iroquois concept of peace is also economic. As John Mohawk said, the peace process starts by looking for a common ground with the enemy. The pursuit of peace is not merely the pursuit of the absence of violence, because peace is never achieved until justice is achieved. And justice is not achieved until everyone's interests are addressed. A modern version, a modern way to say or think about this, a couple of years ago, there were people marching down the street and they were chanting, "No justice, no peace." What is it that keeps the peace in the United States? What is it that keeps the peace in the city of Niagara Falls? Some people think that keeping the peace is a police matter, that we hire peacekeepers, ironically, peacekeepers with weapons, and that what they do is they wait until someone disturbs the peace, and then they go out and they take a kind of revenge. They hurt somebody, they lock somebody away. This is our idea of keeping the peace. The Iroquois idea of keeping the peace is different, is that there cannot be peace unless everyone feels that their perspective has been honored, that their voice has been heard. And so when scholars look at this, they say that there are two kinds of peace, which can be classified as retribution and distribution. Retribution means revenge. In the United States, our laws that keep the peace, we keep the peace with threats of revenge. We say, if somebody breaks the peace in our town, the police and the courts will take revenge for that. They will make you regret it. For example, like during the blizzard, some people came and they smashed the windows of some storefronts by my house, and they broke in and they looted. What is it that stops somebody from looting? That they're going to be caught on video, and that eventually the police are going to track you down, and that they are going to punish you. They're going to make you regret it. That's going to be the idiots who broke into the store down the street from my house, all got caught on camera. I assume that they've all been rounded up by now. However, the other way of looking at peace is distribution, is the sharing of resources, is asking yourself, what is it that causes somebody to become so desperate that they are going to commit a crime like that? And can we kind of, preemptively stop that violence? Can we preemptively stop that crime by making sure that people's basic needs are met and that people feel that they are honored and dignified within our society? The Iroquois word for peace is also the word for health. Chief Oren Lyon said, health and peace are the same thing. You cannot have peace without health. If you don't have access to food, or if you don't have access to, dignity, to representation, that leads to an imbalance that causes that desperation that then manifests itself in violence. In our society, we wait until that violence happens and then we take revenge. The Iroquois idea is different. It is, how do you stop that person from becoming so desperate in the first place? The peacemaker of the Iroquois was male, but interestingly, he did not only empower males to keep this peace, he empowered the women as decision makers. He famously said, "How will you know your nation? You will know your nation through the women. They will be carrying the line because the earth is female, and the women will be working with the earth, and the earth will belong to them." Among the ideas that were introduced among the Iroquois was that the health of the community is dependent on the health of the women in the community, not only the physical health that comes from farming, food production, but also the political representation among the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples of Western New York. It was women who owned the farmland, women who did the farming that provided the majority of the food for the communities. And this meant that the men of the community, if they, made some decision that the women were unhappy with, that the women could go on strike, or they could withhold food, or if the men said that they wanted to launch a military campaign, the women could say, yes, the warriors can go, but you're not bringing any corn with you. So whatever you're going to do, you better be back by lunchtime, because we are not going to provision your military raid. Among the Iroquois, it was women who had the power to vote, to elect the chiefs. This was actually one of those interesting connections between Iroquois democracy and the democracy of the early United States, was that only landowners could vote. In the early United States, it was only men who could own land. Among the Iroquois, it was only women who could own land. And so it was only the women who got to elect the chieftain. Interestingly, when we think about the suffrage movement here in the United States, the political movement to get American women the right to vote, does anybody know, where did the American suffrage movement have its first convention? Where did they meet for the first time to establish their goals and their plan? It was Seneca Falls. It was just around the corner from here. It doesn't seem to be a coincidence that women of the United States, they gathered to make their plan to get the vote in this place, Western New York, where women had had the right to vote for 500 years. Eventually they got it. One of the Iroquois stories about women getting the right to vote was that they kept that the women kept disagreeing that the men kept going off into these raids, campaigns, these wars, all of this stuff. And the women finally got together, the women of the Iroquois, and they told all of the men, they said, we want to start choosing who our leaders are. And the men said no. And then the Iroquois women said, well, fine, then there will be no sex and no babies anymore until we get this. And that ultimately the Iroquois men came around and they said, well, okay. So that's which is I'm reminded of, because this you know, the women's suffrage movement in the United States women did not get the right to vote here in that way. However, a couple of years earlier, it was American women who started a political movement to abolish the sale of alcohol. And the way that they did it was by saying, like, if you come home drunk, then nothing's going to happen. And they took this all the way to the government, and they got this rule passed. So in an Iroquois village, it would be the grandmothers who owned the farmlands, they owned the longhouses, and it was they who got to elect the chief of the village. They also got themselves the right to impeach him if they felt that he started to, you know, act like a king or act like everything belonged to him. If he became reckless or selfish in his rulings, they reserved for themselves the right to take away his authority and to elect someone else. That's how it worked within the Iroquois village. It was a little bit more complex within the Iroquois Confederacy, and that was the gatherings of the 5 nations. Abraham Lincoln famously said that democracy is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the Iroquois were a good example of that. They would first elect a village leader. He would be nominated by clan mothers. After the grandmothers had got together and chosen a chief, they needed to get everybody together, and he needed to be accepted by consensus. Now, consensus is different from a modern election. When we elect a representative or when we elect a president, we do that by popularity. You know, some people vote for this person, some people vote for that person. As we know, our elections tend to end with 51% of the country kind of happy with who they got, and 49% of the country really angry about it. Among the Iroquois, election had to happen by consensus, and that meant that you had to keep debating it until everyone in the tribe agreed, or at least until everyone in the tribe felt that their voice, their perspective, had been heard and acknowledged and respected. This was a process that could take a long time. Once the village had agreed by consensus to approve this leader, there would be a further approval by a council of elders, and then that person would go to a meeting. They would to represent that village among a gathering of all of the representatives in the Iroquois Confederacy. So this would be a total of 50 chiefs representing the 5 nations of the Iroquois. They would debate this. They would finally approve this person as the representative of that village. They would come back for a final round of approval by tribal members. When this happened, the newly elected chief was required to change his name. For one thing, the person's name would be an individual name. It would be a name that would speak of their personal outlook and accomplishments, their personal familial relationships, their clan, what matriarch they were descended from. When somebody became a chief, they would lose that personal name and they would lose that clan name. It was very important that the person think of themselves no longer as just a private individual and no longer as a member of one particular family, but now as a representative for the entire village, someone who had the well-being of the whole village in front of them. I should say here that among the Haudenosaunee, being a chief was a part-time job. It was not a full-time job. You still had to work like everybody else. You still had to help build the longhouse. You still had to go out and hunt. You still had all of the responsibilities that other people had. In addition, you were expected to handle tribal matters, questions that came up between different longhouses, between different family members. You did not get paid for it because you were still expected to be able to provide for yourself. You could not collect taxes, and you did not have a police force. As a matter of fact, even if someone were a chief in an Iroquois village, they could say, "This is my advice for how we should handle this." But if people did not choose to follow their advice, they did not have any coercive apparatus. They didn't have any way of forcing people to do what they said. The only way that you could get people to do what you said was to gain their admiration by being an exemplar, by being an example of hard work and generosity. And that when people saw that you were always the first person to work, always the last person to eat, first person up in the morning, last person to bed at night, and that you spent all of this time doing things for others. The idea was that they would admire you enough so that when you gave your advice about something, they would say, "I want to do what this person advises because I know that this person is a good person and that they're really generous." Oren Lyons said that the peacemaker gave us a process of raising leaders that did not involve politics. So at the end of the day, you got a leader, not a politician. This, and I think particularly, this week with all this stuff going on in the House of Representatives, I think Oren Lyons makes a really fascinating distinction between a leader and a politician. Let's see, I want to know if anybody knows this. The average politician, the average person in the US government spends, when they show up for the whatever 8-hour business day, statistically, they spend half of their day making decisions and having meetings and governing and answering letters and doing all of that stuff. What do they spend the other half of their day doing? Yeah. Fundraising, campaigning. Even when somebody, when we elect a politician, they spend half, you could say, one way to put it would be that our elected officials spend half of their day being a leader and the other half being a politician, fundraising, campaigning, trying to get reelected, doing all of that stuff. Oren Lyons was saying that in the Iroquois system, you did not want a politician. You did not want somebody who was constantly campaigning. You wanted somebody who was going to spend their time leading, and particularly leading by example. This brings us back to being elected by the grandmothers. Here we need to remember this is a difference between, you know, an Iroquois village in the modern United States. In an Iroquois village, like the grandmothers knew all of these people personally. They had seen them all as children. They had seen them growing up. And if there was some guy who kept chasing the grandmothers around saying, make me the chief, make me the chief, you know, if somebody was like a real campaigner, then the grandmothers presumably would identify that person and say, you are not quite ready yet. Maybe instead of following the grandmothers around politicking, you should be leading by example and showing people that you can work hard and be generous. Good. Well, this is our introduction to Western New York indigenous democracy. We will continue with this in a couple of weeks when I will do my next service here. I'll be talking about Western New York indigenous traditions of midwinter, of starting the new year. And then after that, we will continue this lesson on Iroquois democracy. So thank you very much. I will see you in a couple of weeks.